a heart that stirred. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Madison estate, casting long, golden shadows across the marble floors. Thomas Madison stood in his home office, phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that had built his business empire. Numbers and deadlines filled his conversation, while outside, the carefully manicured gardens stretched endlessly toward the horizon. At 42, Thomas had everything money could buy. The sprawling mansion in Connecticut sat on 30 acres of pristine land. Classic cars filled his garage. Art from famous painters hung on his walls. Yet lately something felt hollow in the spaces between his success. Down the hall, 8-year-old Michael Madison sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by hundreds of toy trains. His small fingers moved with careful precision, arranging each car in perfect lines. The trains had to be in order, always in order. Red engine first, then blue, then green, then yellow. When the sequence was right, Michael felt calm. When it was wrong, the world seemed to shake. Michael rarely spoke. Words felt heavy and strange in his mouth, like trying to catch butterflies with his bare hands. The doctors had used big words to explain why Michael was different. Thomas remembered sitting in sterile offices, listening to terms like autism spectrum and sensory processing, feeling helpless for the first time in his life. 3 floors below, in the kitchen that could feed a small restaurant, Grace Williams hummed softly as she prepared Michael's breakfast. At 28, Grace had worked as a housekeeper for the Madison family for 2 years. Her dark skin glowed with warmth, and her eyes held the kind of patience that couldn't be taught or bought. Grace understood that Michael needed his toast cut into perfect triangles. She knew he would only drink milk from the blue cup, never the red one. Most importantly, she had learned to move slowly around him, to speak in gentle tones that didn't startle his sensitive ears. Thomas finished his call and walked toward the kitchen, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the floor. He paused in the doorway, watching Grace arrange Michael's breakfast with the same care an artist might use to paint a masterpiece. "Good morning, Mr. Madison," Grace said, her voice soft and respectful. "Michael's breakfast is ready." Thomas nodded, checking his gold watch. Another day of meetings waited, another day of building wealth that somehow never filled the empty spaces in his heart. Upstairs, Michael heard his father's footsteps and quickly lined up his trains in their morning formation. But something was wrong. The yellow car had a tiny scratch on its side. Michael's breathing grew quick and shallow. His hands began to shake. The scratch meant the train wasn't perfect anymore, and imperfection made his whole world feel unsafe. Thomas climbed the stairs, already planning his first meeting. He found Michael sitting rigid on the floor, tears streaming down his small face. The boy was making soft whimpering sounds, rocking back and forth. "Michael, we need to get ready for breakfast," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same tone he used in boardrooms. Michael's whimpering grew louder. He pointed at the scratched train car, unable to find words to explain the storm inside his chest. Thomas felt his patience thinning. "It's just a toy, son. Come on, we can't be late." But Michael couldn't move. The scratch on the train had broken, something inside his careful world, and he didn't know how to fix it. Downstairs, Grace heard the sound of distress floating through the house. She had learned to recognize Michael's different cries. This was the sound of overwhelm, when his sensitive mind couldn't process too much at once. She quietly climbed the stairs, her footsteps soft as whispers. Grace appeared in the doorway just as Thomas was reaching for Michael's arm, frustration clear on his face. "May I try, Mr. Madison?" Grace asked gently. Thomas stepped back, feeling defeated. He watched as Grace knelt beside his son, not touching, just being present. "Hello, Michael," Grace said in a voice as calm as still water. "I see your yellow. Train has a mark on it." Michael's rocking slowed slightly. Grace reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth. "Sometimes when things get scratched, they just need a gentle cleaning. Would you like to try?" She held the cloth out, not forcing it into Michael's hands, just offering. After a long moment, Michael took it with trembling fingers. Together, they polished the tiny scratch until it was barely visible. Grace helped Michael place the car back in its proper position in the line. "There," Grace said softly. "Sometimes things that look broken just need a little extra care." Michael's breathing steadied. He looked up at Grace with eyes that sparkled with trust and relief. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway watching this simple miracle unfold. His son, who flinched away from Thomas's touch, was leaning slightly toward Grace. Michael, who rarely looked anyone in the eyes, was gazing at Grace as if she had hung the moon. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible but clear as crystal. Those were the first words Thomas had heard his son speak in weeks. Grace smiled and stood slowly. "You're very welcome, Michael. Would you like to come have breakfast? I made your toast into perfect triangles." Michael nodded and carefully stood up, leaving his trains in their perfect order. As they walked toward the stairs, Thomas followed behind, his mind spinning. He had spent years trying to fix his sons, struggles with expensive therapists and special schools. Yet here was Grace, who worked for wages Thomas spent on lunch, showing more understanding in 5 minutes than Thomas had managed in 8 years. In the kitchen, Grace served Michael's breakfast with the same gentle attention she had shown upstairs. She sat beside him while he ate, not talking, just being present. When milk dripped from Michael's cup, she cleaned it without making him feel ashamed. Thomas poured his coffee and found himself watching instead of rushing to his office. He saw how Grace's presence calmed Michael. He noticed how his son's shoulders relaxed when she was near. For the first time in months, Michael finished his entire breakfast. "Grace," Thomas said as she began clearing the dishes. She turned, expecting instructions or perhaps criticism. That was beautiful what you did upstairs," Thomas said, his usual confident voice softer than she had ever heard it. Grace smiled. "Michael is a wonderful boy, Mr. Madison. He just sees the world differently than most of us. That's not something that needs fixing. It's something that needs understanding." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening, in a room that had been locked for years. That evening, Thomas canceled his dinner meeting. Instead, he sat on the floor of Michael's room, watching his son arrange and rearrange his trains. Grace brought them both milk in blue cups and sat with them in comfortable silence. For the first time since Michael's mother had passed 3 years, the house felt like a home. As the weeks passed, Thomas found himself spending more time in the quiet moments with his son. Grace became not just an employee, but a bridge between father and child. She showed Thomas how to speak in gentle tones, how to give Michael space to process the world at his own pace. And slowly, Thomas began to understand that love wasn't about having enough money to fix everything. Sometimes love was as simple as sitting still, being patient, and seeing the world through someone else's eyes. In the golden afternoon light streaming through the windows, Thomas Madison discovered that the greatest wealth he could ever possess was already there, waiting in. The gentle laughter of his son and the wisdom of a woman who understood that some things in life couldn't be bought, only felt with the heart.